So we'd start with a summary of the milk of faith. And the first issue that we discussed was creation. And there we read this. Then Elohim said, let us make humankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the animals, and over all the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the earth. So Elohim created humankind in his own image. In the image of Elohim, he created him, male and female, he created them. So when we discussed this the first time, we said that what this means is that he created man spiritually in the first instance, but also to rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the animals, and over the earth. So that means that it implies that he created them physically as well, because God does not have a form or image, and therefore he created man without form or image, and then that means that he created man physically as well. So we are created as spiritual beings in the first place. Then Yudevave Elohim formed a person from the dust of the ground, and the words are Adam and Adama, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, so that he became a living being. And we identified this a little bit further because the breath of life of which scriptures speak in the Hebrew is neshama, and neshama is breath, and the Ruach HaKodesh can also, or the Holy Spirit, can also be considered the breath of God. It is God himself. So then it means that the breath of life that was blown into man was God himself. And that made the Adam to be a living being, and the Hebrew words are nefesh chai. Nefesh is the life of an animal, so it means that what happened when the chai was blown, when the nefesh became a nefesh chai, he became a living life, because the nefesh is a life of an animal. So in that way, he created us to be a living life, which actually means that from the beginning, he intended man to live eternally. Then out of the ground, Yudevave Elohim caused to grow every tree pleasing in appearance and good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we identified that these trees also have a spiritual meaning. So in a way, they are spiritual trees in the middle of the garden. The tree of life that Elohim gives to eat, because he also says that the tree of life will be on both sides of the river that is to run through the New Jerusalem, and the leaves and the fruit of the tree will be for the healing missions. And then he says that man shall not live from bread alone, but from every word that proceeds from his mouth. So in a way, this then is the tree of life that he is speaking about, the tree that he causes us to eat of. And then he said, you may freely eat from every tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You are not to eat from it, because on the day you eat from it, it will become certain that you will die. So there's a difference between these two trees. The one, he says the tree is there, and he doesn't say anything further, but he then says that man will not live of bread alone, from every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And then of the tree of good and evil, he says, you are not to eat from it, because when you eat from it, it will become certain that you will die. So when one takes of that tree, then you will die. So again, a spiritual tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he says, do not eat. Then the serpent came to the woman and offered the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the woman answered the serpent, we may eat from the fruit of the tree, but about the fruit of the tree of the garden, Elohim said, you are neither to eat from it nor touch it, or you will die. So now, whereas in the earlier text it says that the tree of life is in the middle of the garden. Here it says that you may not eat of the tree of life, a tree that is in the middle of the garden. So both are actually in the middle of the garden. This then places the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the middle of the garden, as well as the tree of life. There is a little bit of a question. Is it the same tree? The tree of life that Elohim gives us to eat, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which Satan offers and man takes. And obviously that will not be good for man in any way, shape or form if he takes from Satan and eats. So the tree of life would then be God's opinion, Elohim's opinion, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would be Satan's interpretation. And that would be legalism, because Satan will clearly not interpret the same information in the same way. He cannot create anything original, and everything he does is a copy of what God does. So then the decision is made, and they eat of the tree. And then Elohim comes to walk in the evening breeze, and they hear the voice of Yudevave, Elohim walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. So the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yudevave Elohim among the trees in the garden. And now the evening breeze in Hebrew is the Ruach Yom. Ruach is wind or spirit, so that's where breeze comes from. But it can also mean spirit. And Yom is a day, and a day can be a day, it can be a year, it can be 1,000 years, it can be exceedingly long, and it can even mean continuously. What it then says is that he wanted Adam to walk with him in the Spirit continuously. And you hear this refrain when Paul starts speaking, how we are to walk in the Spirit continuously. And then, obviously, they hid themselves from Elohim, that they did not want to walk in the Spirit, in the Ruach. Now, the word walk in Hebrew is halach, and halacha is living out one's faith. Yudevave, Elohim called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard your voice in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." So when he cannot walk in the Ruach, he knows that he is naked. The clothing is gone. Up to this point, he was clothed in the Ruach, in the Spirit, in the Shekhinah, in Elohim's presence. When this happens, the result is that the relationship with Elohim is broken, and Adam and Eve's relationship also is broken. Elohim called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." They cannot walk in the Ruach continuously. They're naked, the clothes are gone. They were clothed in the Ruach, in the Shekhinah, in Elohim's presence. Just to repeat what it says. The result, Adam and Eve's relationship is broken, and they start shifting blame. Adam says it's Eve, Eve says it's the snake, and they do not assume accountability for what happened. And then Yeshua comes in the place of Adam, and what he does is he assumes accountability for what Adam had not done. And then he takes the accountability for man, for Adam and for Eve onto himself, and he dies to set the record straight with Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. When she hears the voice of Satan, she already has started off the process of listening to the wrong spirit. And therefore the discernment between the two voices is critically important, and was important right from the beginning.
Veli, I would love to ask you, what would your answer be? Because Eve was blaming Adam, Adam was blaming Eve.
Yes.
So either of them, they did not want to take responsibility.
Yeah.
What really was happening in their minds or hearts when they were not wanting to take responsibility maybe for not hearing or heeding his word.
You see, Adam was the first to be asked. And Adam was the leader. He was the husband. And he was supposed to have warned Eve. And when he didn't warn Eve, the whole problem started. Because he should have warned Eve and he should have turned around to God and said, Eve has eaten, I have not, but put the blame for what she has done onto me, the same as Moses did when Israel sinned. He said, take my life, do not take their lives. And then God said, I will take the life of those who are guilty. Then Abram, what should we say about Abram, our forefather, obtained by his own efforts? For if Abram came to be considered righteous by Elohim because of legalistic observances, then he has something to boast about. But this is not how it is before Elohim. For what does the Tanach say? Avram put his trust in Elohim and it was credited to his account as righteousness. So now the account of someone who is working is credited not on the ground of grace, but on the ground of what is owed him. However, in the case of one who is not working, but rather is trusting in him who makes ungodly people righteous, his trust is credited to him as righteousness. Now, trust in this concept is the same as faith. So he trusted God, which means that he heard the voice of God, he obeyed it, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And we see this for the first time in Scripture when we see the calling of Avram, when Yudevave says to him, get yourself out of your country, away from your kinsmen, away from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you are to be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but I will curse anyone who curses you, and by you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Avram went as Yudevave had said to him, and Lot went with him. Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. So Yudevave said to Avram, and Avram went. So he did as the Lord had told him to do. He heard the voice, he obeyed it, and it was counted to him as righteousness. This accords with the Tanach, where it says, I have appointed you to be a father to many nations. Avram is our father in Elohim's sight because he trusted Elohim as the one who gives life to the dead and calls non-existent things into existence. So these are the two facets of faith. Life to the dead is when he turns around our sin, because that is life to the dead when we obey the voice, and he counts us to righteousness, and he calls non-existent things into existence, because he also promises us things for the future, and which we can trust absolutely because he is reliable. For Avram was past hope, yet in hope he trusted that he would indeed become a father to many nations in keeping with what he had been told. So many will your seed be. His trust did not waver when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered that Avram's womb was dead too. So this is his trust in the non-existing things that the Lord promised to bring into existence, that he would bring him an heir. Now then, there are interesting things about Avram's life that tell us something about the type of person he was. And I think that as far as father of our faith, he therefore also is our example. So the Lord walks with Avram after he ate with Avram, and he walks in the direction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he says, Yudevave says, should Avram what I am about to do, inasmuch as Avram is sure to become a great and strong nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by him. For I have made myself known to him. so that he will give orders to his children and to his household after him to keep the way of Yudhe-Vavhe and to do what is right and just, so that Yudhe-Vavhe may bring about for Avram what he has promised him. Yudhe-Vavhe said, the outcry against Sodom and Amorah is so great and their sin is serious. So because he knew how to give orders to his children and his household to keep the way of Yudhe-Vavhe and do what is right and just. What are those orders he gave them? He ordered them to listen to the voice, to obey it, and then they would do what is just and right. So this actually means that Avram, even though he lived so many years before us, that he already knew how to listen to the voice and obey it, and for it to be counted to righteousness, and he could also teach others how to do it. And then he said, the sin of Sodom and Amorah is so great and their sin is serious. So immediately Abraham knew that God was telling him that Lot was not able to reach the people of Sodom and Amorah. When they reached the place Elohim had told him about, Avram built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of Yudhe-Vavhe called out to him from heaven, Avram, Avram, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear Elohim because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Avram looked up and there was in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Now when Avram went to bring the sacrifice, his son asked him, where is the animal? And he said to his son, God will provide himself the ram. So God will be the ram himself. So here God gives a ram in the place of Isaac. But eventually God gave Yeshua in our place as the ram. So by doing this, Avram was also doing what Adam had not done. And that is that he was prepared to give everything he had to Yudhe-Vavhe, and that he was prepared to sacrifice his son. And this was an amazing thing, that Avram was prepared to give everything he had, that he also was in a position where he could keep the Great Commission. Moses. Now Moshe was tending the sheep of Yithro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock to the far side of the desert, he came to the mountain of Elohim, to Horeb. The angel of Adonai appeared to him in a fire blazing from the middle of a bush. He looked and saw that although the bush was flaming with fire, yet the bush was not being burned up. So the angel of Yudhe-Vavhe appeared to him in the bush, and he was fire. But because the angel of Yudhe-Vavhe, who is Yeshua, was sinless, the fire could not consume him. And therefore the bush also was not consumed, because it was a sign of the sinless God who was present. And because this was not burning up, Moshe was inquisitive. And he said, I'm going over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burned up. When Adonai saw that he had gone over to see, Elohim called to him from the middle of the bush. Moshe, Moshe answered, here I am. The great I am, Yudhe-Vavhe, Adonai, calls Moshe. And this Yudhe-Vavhe is I am. And then Moshe answers and he says, I am. So he is actually countering by saying to Yudhe-Vavhe, I am. And the I am that Moshe then becomes is the same as this I am, Yudhe-Vavhe, because Yudhe-Vavhe starts living in Moshe as the Spirit, and therefore he could hear the voice of the Spirit and obey it. Then, when they are at the sea and they're caught between the two horns of the Red Sea, and Pharaoh is chasing behind them, Moshe says, Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down. Adonai asked Moshe, why are you crying to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift your staff, reach out with your hand over the sea and divide it in two. The people of Israel would advance into the sea on dry ground. So they're totally caught. And on a natural base, they should not be able to escape at all. But also understand that if the Lord did not bring Israel into this impossible position, there would be no way of killing the Egyptians, because if they were to go on dry land directly from Egypt to Israel, because the Suez Canal was not yet there, and therefore they could go on dry ground. But then they moved south from there to between the two horns of the Red Sea. And then he lifted up his hand and he opened up the sea. So this Moshe, just listening to the voice, actually created a way for Israel to be saved, and also for the Egyptians to be killed. As for me, I will make the Egyptians hard-hearted, and they will march in after them. Thus I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all his army, chariots, and cavalry. Then the Egyptians will realize that I am Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh when I have won myself glory at the expense of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his cavalry. So just simply go through here, and then he killed the Egyptians by closing down the sea after Israel. Moses listens to the voice and he does it. And then at Meribah, he had been tested by Israel continuously. And here it became too much for him. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to him, take the staff, assemble the community, you and Aaron, your brother, and before their eyes tell the rock to produce its water. You will bring them water out of the rock and thus enable the community and their livestock to drink. Moshe took the staff from the presence of Adonai as he had ordered him. But after Moshe and Aaron had assembled the community in front of the rock, he said to them, listen here, you rebels. Are we supposed to bring you water from this rock? And here he starts off, and clearly he's not listening to the Father, because it is not he that brings water from the rock. It is the Father who brings water from the rock. And then Moshe raised his hand and hit the rock twice with his staff. Water flowed out in abundance, and the community and their flock drank. So he hits the rock in disobedience to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. The previous time Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh had told him to hit this rock. This time he told him to speak to the rock, and he hit it. So this was the beginning of Moshe's problems, so that he did not allow them to go into the land. Jethro, or also known as Reuel, the friend of God, comes and he gives Moses advice on how to govern Israel and to divide Israel into groups of 3 and 6. One leader over 2 and one leader over 5. And then he says to Moses, after he has given this advice, he says, if you do this, and God is directing you to do it. So I'm telling you, I think this is what you should do. If God also tells you to do it, you will be able to endure. And all these people too will arrive at their destination peacefully. Moshe paid attention to his father-in-law's counsel and did everything he said. He actually chose people, and then he started governing Israel, not only on his own, but other competent people. Moshe chose competent men from all Israel and made them heads over the people in charge of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. As a general rule, they settled the people's disputes. The difficult cases they brought to Moshe, but every simple matter they decided for themselves. So it means that in these small groups, all of these problems that arose in Israel were settled, and it was not necessary to bring it to Moses. Obviously, there for the very lowest level, there were problems, but they just took it to the next level. And therefore, a lot of the cases never came to Moses because they often found a reason to solve their problems. Israel fears the voice. All the people experienced the thunder, the lightning, and the sound of the shofar and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled. Standing at a distance, they said to Moshe, "You speak with us, and we will listen. But don't let Elohim speak with us, or we will die." So they experienced this mighty voice. And because of that, they didn't want to listen to the voice. And they said, "Don't speak to us, because we will die." So they feared God and did not want to listen to the voice. But God wanted them to hear the voice and obey it. And Moshe answered the people, "Don't be afraid, because God has come only to test you and make you fear him, so that you won't commit sins. You won't commit sins so that you will hear the voice, obey it, and it will be counted to you as righteousness." Then they said that they don't want to speak to God directly, but that God had to speak to them through Moshe. So the people stood at a distance, but Moshe approached the thick darkness where Elohim was. Then, when he came down from the mountain, already they had not listened to the voice, they had not learned to listen to the voice, and wanted Moshe to speak to him. He had disappeared into the fire at the top of the mountain. They thought he was dead, and they wanted other gods. When the people saw that Moshe was taking a long time to come down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Get busy and make us gods to go ahead of us, because this Moshe, the man that brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Have your wives, sons, and daughters strip off their gold earrings and bring them to me." He says, strip off the earrings. They're not hearing the voice of God, so they're deaf. And then Aaron says, strip off your earrings. You can't hear, your ears are only there to bear earrings. Strip them off and bring them to me. Aaron takes this all, and the people stripped off their gold earrings and brought them to Aaron. He received what they gave him, melted it down, and made it into the shape of a calf. They said, "Israel, there's your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt." On seeing this, Aaron built an altar in front of it and proclaimed, "Tomorrow is to be a feast for Yud-Heh Vav-Heh." And the word that he used is Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. So he was actually saying that this calf is Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. And therefore, by manner of speaking, he was not replacing Yud-Heh Vav-Heh as the God of Israel, but had created an idol that was Yud-Heh Vav-Heh. But clearly, God had said, you are not to make any image for yourself. Moshe turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, tablets inscribed on both sides, on the front and on the back. The tablets were the work of Elohim, and the writing was the writing of Elohim engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moshe, "It sounds like war in the camp." He answered, "That is neither the clamor of victory nor the wailings of defeat. What I hear is the sound of people singing." But the moment Moshe got near the camp, when he saw the calf and dancing, his own anger blazed up. He threw down the tablets he had been holding and shattered them at the base of the mountain. It is said of the Torah that it is the marriage contract between God and Israel. So it is known as the Ketubah. And for this means that Israel was being unfaithful to God. And Moses had only one thing he could do, and that is that he had to annul the marriage. And the way that he annulled the marriage is by breaking the marriage contract. which is the tablets that he had. So he knew that things had gone wrong. But interestingly, Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting. He said to Moshe. So there is a little bit of an insinuation that Joshua was on the mountain with Moshe when he received the tablets the first time. So you can see what a righteous man Joshua was, because there's this insinuation that he was there as well. Then Moshe goes and he calls to him all of those who are for Yudhevave, and the sons of Levi did what Moshe said. They came to him with spears, and that day they killed 3,000 of the people of Israel. Moshe said, you have consecrated yourself today to Adonai, because every one of you has been against his own son and against his own kinsman, in order to bring a blessing on yourselves today. The next day Moshe said to the people, you have committed a terrible sin. Now I will go up to Adonai. Maybe I will be able to atone for your sin. But he had commanded the sons of Levi to kill these 3,000 people. So what did he go up the mountain with? He went up the mountain with the lives of these 3,000 people who had been killed, and he atoned for Israel with the lives of those 3,000 people that he went up with the blood of those 3,000 people. Then Moshe went back to Yudhevave and said, please, these people have committed a terrible sin. They've made themselves a god out of gold. But if you will just forgive their sin, but if you don't, I beg you, blot me out of your book which you have written. So he's then saying, I will do what Abram was prepared to do, and I will die in the place of Israel. And Adonai answered Moshe, those who have sinned against me are the ones that I will blot out of my book. Then the Lord passes by Moses and he proclaims, Yudhevave, Yudhevave, El, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So this is God's righteousness. When he passes Moses, this is what he says. Okay, let's discuss what Moses is an image of. Abram is an image of a man who served God fully. And through that man, God did mighty things. Moses is a man who served God fully, but he also was a leader who served God fully. And he acted as God's judge in Israel and saw to it that God and Israel remained in a good situation with each other. So he is an example of acting on behalf of Israel to see to it that God will forgive. By sending the Levites to kill those 3,000, he can go and atone. And then he goes up on the mountain and he atones. And then God tells him what his righteousness looks like. So he had the tremendous privilege of hearing this from God himself.
In Exodus 18,
Yeah,
when Jethro gave Moses advice
yeah,
that Moses, I'm giving you advice,
yeah,
but if God tells you to do it,
yeah,
then you will endure.
yes.
Can you unpack that statement? Does it really mean that Moses or any person cannot do something which God did not tell him to do, even though that person, maybe like Jethro, gave him advice?
You see, what happened is that Moses alone was not enough to see to all of the complaints that were happening, because if the entire Israel were living in righteousness, they would not have any problems with each other. There would be no cases that they would have against each other, and there would be no judgment. So then, what would Moses do? Because Moses wouldn't need to judge. But because they refused to listen to the voice of God, judgment was necessary. And Moses was not enough to listen to all of these cases. So Jethro came and said to him, "This is my advice to you." But Jethro's name also is Reuel, which means friend of God. So he also here heard from God. And what he heard from God is, give advice to your son-in-law and tell your son-in-law this is what he is to do. Is to divide the entire Israel into groups of 3 and 6, because there's a leader over 1,000 and a leader over 100. But then in another place we read of a leader over 500. So there was a leader over 1,000, leader over 500, and a leader over 100. So one leader over 1,000 is a leader over 2 leaders over 500, and a leader over 500 is a leader over 5 leaders over 100. You see? And then it repeats itself. Then a leader over 100 is a leader over 2 leaders over 50, and the leader over 50 is a leader over 5 leaders over 10. So you see that just repeats. And in the final analysis, it is Yeshua who leads over 2, which is over Kepha and Yochanan, and they each dealt with 5 of the other disciples. But Yeshua dealt with all 12 of them. He was the 13th one. He dealt with Peter and John mainly, and Peter and John then also dealt with the other 2 groups of 5 each, I'm very sure, because this is what the pattern looks like. So that means that the entire leadership of Israel was never in a group bigger than 6 people. It was always 3 people, 6 people, 3 people, 6 people. 1 over 2 and 2 over 5 each.
And lastly, my other question, Aaron, when Moshe was at the mountain,
Yes,
here are the people, they start grumbling.
yeah,
And then he says that it is because of your ears cannot hear. He takes off their earrings and start to make an idol.
yes.
And when Moses comes back, so now my question here is that, was Aaron considerate of the leadership of Moses, or was he wanting to be an equal to Moses in the leadership?
I think that he was also concerned that Moses was not going to return, because you see, Moses entered the thick darkness at the top of the mountain, and the scripture says that there was fire there. So Moses entered into the fire. So everyone thought he was dead. And I think Aaron also thought he was dead. But Aaron knew that the one who had led them out of Egypt was Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And therefore he says, tomorrow we will have a feast for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So he was saying that this calf that he has made is Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. But Israel said to him that that they wanted other gods. But he was not really allowing them to take another God, because he said that God was Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. We're going to talk about entering the rest. Therefore, as Ruach HaKodesh says, today, if you hear Elohim's voice, don't harden your hearts as they did in the bitter quarrel on that day in the wilderness when you put Elohim to the test. Yes, your fathers put me to the test. They challenged me and they saw my work for 40 years. So what he's actually implying here is you didn't listen to my voice in the desert. And that is why you fell in the desert, because they refused to hear the voice of God. Then they heard the voice of God. When they heard the voice of God, they said it was too loud, but God was just warning them that he is a mighty God, and that for that reason, they had to be very careful to hear that silent voice correctly, but they refused. And then it says, Therefore, I was disgusted with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray. They have not understood how I do things. In my anger, I swore that they would not enter my rest. He was actually saying their hearts are always going astray. They don't understand that the way that I work is I talk to them, that they should obey me, and that it will be counted to them as righteousness. Then he says, watch out, brothers, that none of you will be, that there will not be in any one of you an evil heart lacking trust. So he's saying that if we lack trust, we don't trust God, that which would cause you to apostatize from the living Elohim. Instead, keep exhorting each other every day as long as it is called today, so that none of you will become hardened by the deceit of sin. So he's saying you just simply cannot afford to listen to any other voice. You have to listen to the voice of God. It's the only way to survive. And with whom was Elohim disgusted for 40 years? Those who sinned, yes, they fell dead in the wilderness. And to whom was it that he swore that they would not enter his rest? Those who were disobedient. So we see that they were unable to enter because of a lack of trust. So again, it says they fell dead because they refused to hear the voice, and that also is the reason that they could not enter the rest. Therefore, let us be terrified of the possibility that even though the promise of entering his rest remains, any of you might be judged for having fallen short of it. For good news has also been proclaimed to us, just as it was to them. But the message they heard didn't do them any good, because those who heard it did not combine it with trust. So they heard the voice, but they did not trust the voice, and therefore it was not counted to them as righteousness, because they disobeyed that voice. So the good news is that we can hear the voice, that we can obey it, and that he will count it to us as righteousness. So the good news that was proclaimed to them has also been proclaimed to us. So that good news that comes through the Spirit living in us already was applicable to them in the desert, according to Paul. If they had listened to the voice, it would have been counted to them as righteousness, and they would have been saved. Because they did not, they were not saved, and they fell in the desert. For it is we who have trusted who enter the rest. It is just as he said, and in my anger I swore that they would not enter my rest. He swore this, even though his works have been in existence since the founding of the universe. For there is a place where it is said concerning the seventh day, and Elohim rested on the seventh day from all his works. And once more, our text says, they will not enter my rest. So he entered his rest, and he stopped from the works that he had done to create, and he put his laws into the universe that made it possible for the universe to continue. And therefore he is sustaining the universe through his laws that apply to it and with which it continues to exist. For it is we who have trusted who entered the rest. It is just as he said, in my anger I swore that they would not enter my rest. He swore this, even though his works have been in existence since the founding of the universe. For there is a place where it is said concerning the seventh day, and Elohim rested on the seventh day from all his works. And once more, our present text says, they will not enter my rest. So this Shabbat keeping is critically important. We need to hear the voice and we need to obey it. And when? Today. Actually, today means now. It means minute by minute. When we hear the voice, we must obey it, and it will be counted to us as righteousness for every day. For if Joshua had given them rest, Elohim would not have spoken of another day. So there remains a Shabbat keeping for Elohim's people. For the one who has entered Elohim's rest has also rested from his own work, as Elohim did from his. And this is actually saying that we need to rest from our own work. So we do not need to work out how we must do our work. We must know the laws that apply to our work, and he will remind us of those laws as we continue, and he will count it to us as righteousness. So we will be able to do as he wants, even in our daily life. I am astounded that you are so quick to remove yourselves from me in Galatia, because this is a critically important thing, that we are to enter the rest hearing the voice of the Spirit. I am astounded that you are so quick to remove yourselves from me, the one who called you by the Messiah's grace, and turn to some other supposedly good news, which is not good news at all. What is really happening is that certain people are pestering you and trying to pervert the genuine good news of the Messiah, because they're telling you to get yourself circumcised and to keep the whole Torah, because that is what this was about. But even we, or for that matter, an angel from heaven, were to announce to you some so-called good news contrary to the good news we did announce to you, let him be under a curse forever. We said it before, and I say it again. If anyone announces good news contrary to what you received, let him be under a curse forever. There is no other good news. The good news is that God has given his Spirit to live in us, and his Spirit in us leads us to deal with our sin and our unrighteousness, and therefore we cannot earn anything, because it is him dealing with our sin and our unrighteousness in us. Then Paul went to check out whether this message that he was preaching was correct. And he said, 14 years after I again went up to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas, and I took with me Titus. I went up in obedience to a revelation, and I explained to them the good news as I proclaim it among the Gentiles, but privately to the acknowledged leaders. I did this out of concern that my current or previous work might have been in vain, but they didn't force my Gentile companion Titus to undergo Brit Milah. So Paul was concerned about the message that he was preaching, and he went to check whether this message was correct. And therefore he went to Jerusalem, and he took someone with him who had not been circumcised. John and Peter clearly knew that he had not been circumcised, and they did not insist. So that means that they did not insist that he needed to keep the whole Torah and be circumcised. What the Messiah has freed us for is freedom. Therefore, stand firm. Don't let yourselves be tied up again to a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. I will tell you that if you undergo Brit Milah, the Messiah will be of no advantage to you at all. Again, I warn you, any man who undergoes Brit Milah or circumcision is obligated to observe the entire Torah. So that means that if you're circumcised, you have to keep the whole Torah. And obviously, he and all the other leaders were circumcised. So he was saying there is a differentiation between the nations and Israel. Therefore, and then after this meeting in Acts, Jacob, or also known as James, says, therefore, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Goyim in the nations who are turning to Elohim. Instead, we should write to them a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols, idolatry, fornication. The opposite of fornication is absolute reliability. What is strangled, and what is strangled is not clean to eat, and from blood, because blood stands for murder, and murder also is ignoring your brother, or calling him a fool, or gossiping about a brother. So he's saying that, and the opposite of blood and the opposite of murder is love. So what they have decided here is that you have to be absolutely reliable, and you have to be absolutely loving. So that means that you need to learn the ethical laws of the scriptures, and that is what you need to do. For from the earliest times, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. So if you need to find out what this is about, you can go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and you can go to the houses of Jewish believers, and they will explain what this means to you. And then the final thing is the fire fell. The fire fell on Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy the flesh because it was totally sinful. Then there was fire in the burning bush that did not consume the bush, because what was in the bush was sinless. Then the Torah was given on Sinai, and obviously it was meant to expose sin and consume the flesh. At the inauguration of the tabernacle, the fire fell on the altar and consumed the flesh. Korach and the 250 men opposed Moses and Aaron. Korach was swallowed by the earth, as the sacrifices are swallowed for the common people, and the leaders are swallowed by the priests, and the 250 men were consumed by the fire on the censers that they had with them. The banned items at Ai ended with Achan being burnt in fire, because the Lord said so. Gideon went to fetch unleavened bread and a lamb, which in a specific sense actually alludes to the Passover and therefore to Yeshua's execution, and the angel of Elohim makes it go up in fire. At the inauguration of the temple, fire falls on the temple altar and it consumes the flesh. When Elijah calls on the Lord, the fire falls out of heaven and consumes the flesh, but also the 12 stones that are a symbol of Israel. By consuming the 12 stones, God is saying that Israel's flesh will be consumed because they live in sin. And then on Shavuot, on Pentecost, fire falls on the head of the disciples. And that means that they start off with a process that consumes the flesh. Now, the last portion I want to deal with is about the heart of the gospel. After Yeshua had taken the wine, he said, "It is accomplished." Let his head droop, and he delivered up his spirit. And then we know that for while we were still helpless, at the right time, Messiah died on behalf of ungodly people. Now, it is a rare event when someone gives up his life, even for the sake of somebody righteous. Although possibly for a truly good person, one might have the courage to die. But Elohim demonstrates his own love for us in that the Messiah died on our behalf while we were still sinners. Therefore, since we have now come to be considered righteous by means of his bloody sacrificial death, how much more will we be delivered through him from the anger of God's judgment? 4. What the Torah could not do by itself, because it lacked the power to make the old nature cooperate, God did by sending his own Son as a human being with a nature like our own sinful one. God did this in order to deal with sin, and in so doing he executed the punishment against sin in human nature, so that the just requirement of the Torah might be fulfilled in us, who do not run our lives according to what the old nature wants, but according to what the Spirit wants. So this says that if we live as Spirit wants, that we will actually fulfill the righteous requirements of the law. For those who identify with their old nature set their minds on the things of the old nature, but those who identify with the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Having one's mind controlled by the old nature is death, but having one's mind controlled by the Spirit is life and shalom. For the mind controlled by the old nature is hostile to God, because it does not submit itself to God's Torah. Indeed, it cannot. Yeshua answered him, if someone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Someone who doesn't love me doesn't keep my words. And the word you are hearing is not my own, but that of the Father who sent me. I have told you these things while I'm still with you. But the Counselor, Ruach HaKodesh, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything. That is, he will remind you of everything I have said to you. So the Counselor will remind us of everything that Yeshua taught his disciples. And therefore, we must know these things and must know the Scripture so that he can remind. And Yeshua says, but I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For if I don't go away, the comforting Counselor will not come to you. However, if I do go, I will send him to you. When he comes, he will show that the world is wrong about sin, about righteousness, and about judgment, about sin, and that people don't dare trust in me. So when the Ruach shows us sin, we will put our trust in him, and then we will know what our sin is, because the world does not want to know about their sin. Of righteousness, because due to his righteousness, he is with the Father, and he prayed that we would be with him where he is. And therefore, we will be in the presence of the Father as well. And therefore, we will be able to live in righteousness and in about judgment, in that the ruler of this world has been judged, so that those who are not with him in righteousness will not see the Father. For the whole Torah is summed up in this one sentence: love your neighbor as yourself. But if you go on snapping at each other, tearing each other to pieces, watch out, and you will be destroyed by each other. What I'm saying is this: run your lives by the Spirit, then you will not do what your old nature wants. For the old nature wants what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit wants what is contrary to the old nature. These oppose each other so that you find yourselves unable to carry out your good intentions. But if you are led by the Spirit, if you are not in subjection to the system that results from perverting the Torah into legalism. It's quite clear that he wants us to live controlled by the Spirit, and that this is what he died for, excepting for the fact that he died to pay for all sin. But he also died to pour out his Spirit, so that his Spirit can empower us to live the lives that the Lord wants us to live.